The Golden Boy's Shadow. Some people say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when the person you die for chooses someone else over you? My name is Jade, and this is the story of how my brother's wedding became the day I learned that loyalty isn't always a two-way street. Marcus has always been my hero. When our parents died in that terrible accident 12 years ago, I was just 14 and he was 22. While other guys his age were starting careers and dating, Marcus dropped everything to become my guardian. He worked double shifts at the auto shop, his hands permanently stained with grease, just to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. I still remember the nights he'd come home exhausted, but he'd still sit with me at our rickety dining table, helping me with algebra homework. He barely understood himself. When I needed a dress for my first school dance, he worked overtime for 3 weeks straight to buy me something beautiful. He taught me how to drive in his beat-up truck, patiently enduring my terrible parking attempts in empty mall lots. Marcus never made me feel like I was holding him back, even though I knew I was. While his friends went to college and started their adult lives, he was stuck raising his little sister. But he never complained, never made me feel guilty. He'd just ruffle my hair and tell me we were a team. By the time I turned 24, Marcus had finally built a life for himself. He'd opened his own auto repair shop, bought a small house on the nice side of town, and started dating again. I was so proud of him and honestly relieved that he could finally focus on his own happiness. That's when Vivian entered our lives. Like a perfectly manicured hurricane, Vivian Ashford came from the kind of old money family that had streets named after them. She was 28, worked in marketing for her family's investment firm, and looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a magazine. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her clothes expensive and tailored. She drove a white BMW and lived in one of those modern downtown condos with floor-to-ceiling windows. When Marcus introduced us at Sunday dinner, 3 months into their relationship, I genuinely wanted to like her. Marcus was glowing with happiness, more relaxed and confident than I'd seen him in years. If this polished woman could make my brother smile like that, then I was determined to welcome her into our small family. "So, you're the famous little sister," Vivian said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Her smile was bright and warm, but something in her eyes felt calculating. "Marcus talks about you constantly." "All good things, I hope," I replied, trying to match her confidence. "Oh, of course," she laughed, a tinkling sound like expensive wind chimes. "He's so protective of you. It's sweet how close you two are." The way she said sweet made it sound almost inappropriate, but Marcus was beaming, so I pushed the uncomfortable feeling aside. Maybe I was just nervous about sharing my brother's attention after having him all to myself for so long. Over the following months, I watched Marcus fall deeper in love. Vivian introduced him to her world of wine tastings and charity galas, expensive restaurants, and weekend trips to her family's lake house. Marcus started dressing better, speaking more confidently, carrying himself like he finally belonged somewhere important, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel like I was disappearing from his life. Behind the perfect smile, the transformation was gradual, like watching someone drift away on a slow current. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just jealous that Marcus had found someone who made him so happy. But as the months passed, Vivian's mask began to slip, revealing glimpses of something cold and calculating beneath her polished exterior. It started with small exclusions that seemed almost accidental. Marcus and I had always spent Saturday mornings together, grabbing breakfast at our favorite diner and catching up on the week. But suddenly Vivian would schedule romantic brunches or shopping trips that just happened to conflict with our time. When I mentioned it to Marcus, he'd look genuinely confused. "Oh, I'm sorry, Jade. Vivian planned this spa day weeks ago. Can we reschedule?" He'd seemed torn, but he always chose her plans over ours. Then came the subtle insults disguised as concern. When Marcus mentioned I was working 2 jobs to save up for college, Vivian would tilt her head sympathetically and say, "Oh, honey, that sounds exhausting. Have you considered that maybe you're just not college material? Not everyone needs a degree to be successful." Her tone was so sweet, so caring, that Marcus would nod along, completely missing the poison in her words. The worst part was how she behaved when Marcus wasn't around. At family gatherings, she'd position herself so I was always on the outside of conversations. When Marcus went to get drinks, she'd turn to her friends and completely ignore me, as if I'd simply vanished. If I tried to join their discussions about restaurants or vacation spots, she'd smile patronizingly and say, "Oh, Jade, you probably haven't been to places like that." 6 months into their relationship, Marcus proposed at the same restaurant where our parents had celebrated their anniversary. He was so excited when he called to tell me, his voice breaking with emotion. I was genuinely happy for him, even as my heart broke a little, knowing that Vivian would now be a permanent fixture in our lives. The engagement party was held at Vivian's parents' country club, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a view of the lake. I'd saved up to buy a nice dress, a simple black number that I thought looked elegant, but when I arrived I realized I'd severely underestimated the dress code. Every woman there looked like she'd stepped off a red carpet. "Oh, Jade," Vivian approached me with that familiar fake smile, "you look comfortable." She was wearing a stunning emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I should have mentioned this was a formal event, but don't worry. Not everyone needs to look perfect. Her bridesmaids, a group of equally polished women, exchanged knowing glances. I spent the entire evening feeling like an outsider, watching Marcus navigate effortlessly through Vivian's world while I stood awkwardly by the appetizer table. When Vivian asked me to be her maid of honor 2 weeks later, I was genuinely surprised. Marcus was thrilled, talking about how wonderful it was that his 2 favorite women were going to be so close. I said yes, hoping maybe this was an olive branch, a chance for us to start over. I should have known better. The maid of honor duties became a series of humiliations disguised as wedding planning. Vivian scheduled all the important events during my work hours, then acted disappointed when I couldn't attend. When I suggested budget-friendly alternatives for the bachelorette party, she'd sigh dramatically and say, "I suppose not everyone can afford the finer things in life." The dress fittings were particularly brutal. While her other bridesmaids chatted about their latest vacations and designer purchases, I stood quietly as the seamstress pinned my dress. Vivian would make little comments about how the color washed me out, or how the style wasn't really flattering for my figure. The breaking point came during the final dress fitting, 3 weeks before the wedding. I'd lost weight from stress and working extra shifts to pay for all the wedding expenses. As the seamstress took in the dress, Vivian watched with barely concealed irritation. "You know, Jade," she said, examining her own reflection in the 3-way mirror, "Marcus is worried about you. He thinks you might be jealous of our relationship." I stared at her, shocked by the direct attack. "That's not true. I just want Marcus to be happy." "Do you?" Her voice was sharp now, all pretense of sweetness gone. "Because honestly, it seems like you can't stand that he's found someone who's actually on his level, someone who can give him the life he deserves." The seamstress continued working, pretending not to hear the tension in the room. I felt tears stinging my eyes, but refused to give Vivian the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "I love my brother," I said quietly. "I've always supported his happiness." Vivian stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "Well then, you'll understand why it's time for you to step back. Marcus doesn't need a needy little sister holding him back anymore. He needs a real partner, someone who can elevate him instead of dragging him down." In that moment, I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't about jealousy or wedding stress. Vivian had been systematically working to remove me from Marcus's life and she was succeeding. Part 3. The Wedding Day Massacre. The morning of Marcus's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of the lakeside venue. Despite everything that had happened with Vivian, I woke up determined to put my feelings aside and focus on my brother's happiness. This was his day, and I wouldn't let our complicated situation ruin it for him. I arrived at the venue early, wearing a soft blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. It was simple but elegant, and I'd spent extra time on my hair and makeup, wanting to look perfect for Marcus. The ceremony location was breathtaking, with white roses and fairy lights, creating a romantic atmosphere overlooking the lake. I found Vivian in the bridal suite, surrounded by her bridesmaids, who were all getting their final touch-ups done by a team of professional stylists. The room buzzed with excitement and champagne-fueled laughter. When I knocked and entered, the conversation died down slightly. "Oh, Jade," Vivian said, barely glancing up from where her makeup artist was applying the finishing touches to her already flawless face. "You're here early. I wanted to see if you needed any help with last-minute preparations," I offered, genuinely trying to be supportive. Her bridesmaids exchanged those familiar looks, and one of them, a tall brunette named Cassandra, smirked. "I think we have everything under control here. Maybe you could go check on the ushers or something?" I felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but I forced a smile. "Of course. I'll see you before the ceremony." As I left the bridal suite, I could hear their laughter resume, along with whispered comments I tried not to analyze. Instead, I threw myself into helping with last-minute details, arranging flowers, greeting early guests, and making sure everything was running smoothly. The ceremony itself was absolutely beautiful. Marcus looked incredibly handsome in his black tuxedo, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes as the music began. When Vivian appeared at the end of the aisle in her stunning white gown, I had to admit she looked like a princess from a fairy tale. The love on Marcus's face was unmistakable, and for a moment all my resentment melted away. This was what mattered, my brother's happiness. Their vows were heartfelt and emotional. Marcus spoke about finding his soulmate, about how Vivian had shown him what true partnership looked like. Vivian talked about building a life together, about supporting each other's dreams and creating their own family legacy. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, including mine. During the cocktail hour, I mingled with guests, many of whom I'd known since childhood. Marcus's friends from the auto shop were there alongside Vivian's sophisticated crowd, creating an interesting mix of personalities. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time, and I started to relax, thinking maybe we'd get through this day without any drama. The reception began smoothly, with dinner served under twinkling lights as the sun set over the lake. I was seated at the head table as maid of honor, though I noticed I was placed at the far end, away from the bride and groom. Still, I tried to enjoy the evening, chatting with the other members of the wedding party and savoring the delicious food. When it came time for speeches, the best man went first with a funny story about Marcus's bachelor party. Then it was my turn. I'd spent weeks writing and rewriting my speech, wanting to strike the perfect balance between heartfelt and appropriate. I stood up, my heart pounding, and began to speak about the Marcus I knew, the young man who'd sacrificed everything to raise his little sister, who'd worked multiple jobs to keep us together, who'd taught me that family means never giving up on each other. I talked about his kindness, his strength, his unwavering loyalty to the people he loved. As I spoke, I could see guests wiping their eyes. Marcus was crying openly, and he mouthed "thank you" to me from across the table. The applause was thunderous, and for a moment I felt genuinely hopeful. Maybe Vivian would see how much I loved Marcus and realize we didn't have to be enemies. But when I looked at her face, my blood turned to ice. Instead of tears or appreciation, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Pure, undiluted rage. Her perfect composure had cracked just enough for me to see the fury burning beneath. The recording that changes everything. I found refuge in the bridal suite where this nightmare had begun hours earlier. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me and finally let myself fall apart completely. 26 years old, and I felt like that scared 14-year-old girl again, abandoned and alone. How could she do that to me? How could Marcus just stand there and let it happen? I collapsed into the velvet chair where Vivian had gotten ready, sobbing into my hands. Everything I'd feared was coming true. I was losing my brother, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. After what felt like forever, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Marcus, looking uncomfortable and conflicted, his bow tie loosened and his hair slightly messed. "Jade, can we talk?" "What's there to talk about?" I wiped my face with the back of my hand, trying to compose myself. "Your wife just humiliated me in front of your entire wedding." Marcus shifted awkwardly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Look, I know what she said was harsh, but she's been drinking. And the stress of the wedding, she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Even as he said it, I could tell he didn't fully believe his own words. Didn't mean it. I stood up, anger finally cutting through my hurt. "Marcus, she called me a freeloader in front of 200 people. She made it clear that I don't belong in your life." "You're being dramatic," he said, and those words hit me harder than Vivian's speech had. "It's my wedding day, Jade. Can't you just let this go for once? Stop making everything about you. Stop making everything about me. This man, my brother, who I'd watched sacrifice everything for me, was now acting like I was the problem." I stared at him, really seeing him for the first time in months. Vivian hadn't just married him. She'd been slowly poisoning him against me, and it had worked. "You're right," I said quietly. "I should go home." "Jade, don't be like this." "No, Marcus, you've made your choice clear." I grabbed my purse and started toward the door. "I hope she makes you happy." I was halfway to the parking lot when I realized I'd forgotten my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only valuable thing I owned and the last connection to our mother. I couldn't leave them behind. Reluctantly, I made my way back to the bridal suite, hoping it would be empty so I could grab the earrings and disappear. But as I approached the door, I heard voices inside. Vivian's voice, specifically, and she sounded completely different than I'd ever heard her before. Gone was the sweet, cultured tone she used around Marcus. This voice was sharp, cruel, and completely unguarded. I was about to knock when I realized what she was saying, and my hand froze halfway to the door. "Did you see her pathetic little face when I called her out?" Vivian was laughing, a harsh sound that made my skin crawl, acting like Marcus is some kind of hero for raising his trashy sister. My heart started pounding. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and started recording, pressing myself against the wall next to the door. "The truth is, I can't stand her," Vivian continued. "She's everything I hate about poor people. Desperate, clingy, and completely pathetic. The way she looks at Marcus like he owes her something just because their parents died. Please." One of her bridesmaids giggled. "The look on her face during your speech was priceless. I thought she was going to cry right there at the head table." "Marcus is so stupid," Vivian said, and my blood turned to ice. "He actually thinks I care about his charity case, sister. The plan was always to get rid of her once we were married. I mean, can you imagine trying to build a proper social life with that anchor dragging us down?" "What are you going to do?" another voice asked. "Simple. I'm going to convince Marcus that she's jealous and unstable, that she's trying to sabotage our marriage because she can't handle not being the center of his world anymore. I've already started planting the seeds. Did you hear how he defended me tonight instead of her?" My hands were trembling as I held the phone, but I kept recording. Within 6 months, she'll be completely out of our lives. Marcus will finally see that he needs to choose between his past and his future. And obviously, he's going to choose the woman who can give him the life he deserves, not some needy little sister who's been holding him back for years. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This woman had planned my destruction from the very beginning. Every kind word, every fake smile, every moment of pretended acceptance. It had all been a lie while she systematically worked to turn my brother against me. But as I stood there listening to her reveal her true nature, I realized something important. She'd just handed me the weapon I needed to expose her for who she really was. Part 5, Sweet Revenge at the Cake Cutting. I stood outside that bridal suite for another 5 minutes, recording every vicious word that came out of Vivian's mouth. She talked about how she planned to isolate Marcus from his lower-class friends, how she was going to convince him to sell his auto shop and work for her father's investment firm, how she intended to completely remake him into the kind of husband her family would approve of. The best part is, he thinks this was all his idea, she laughed. Men are so easy to manipulate when you know which buttons to push. A little praise here, a little doubt there, and they'll do whatever you want. When I finally had enough evidence to bury her, I quietly slipped away and returned to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, listening to the recording over and over, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and vindication. Everything I'd suspected about Vivian was true, and now I had proof. But what was I going to do with it? I could show Marcus later, but would he believe me? Would he think I'd somehow faked it? Or would he be so invested in his new life that he'd find a way to rationalize Vivian's words? No, if I was going to do this, it had to be now, in front of everyone who'd witnessed my humiliation. They needed to see who Vivian really was behind. Her perfect facade. I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror, wiped away the remaining tears, and walked back into the reception with purpose. The cake cutting was about to begin, and guests were gathering around the elaborate 3-tiered cake decorated with white roses and gold details. Marcus and Vivian stood together, both of them smiling and posing for photos. Vivian had completely transformed back into the blushing bride, her earlier cruelty hidden behind that perfect mask. She whispered something in Marcus's ear that made him laugh, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered her words. Marcus is so stupid. The plan was always to get rid of her. The DJ handed the microphone to Marcus for a final thank you speech before the cake cutting. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about how perfect the day had been, and expressed his gratitude to all the people who'd helped make their wedding special. I'd especially like to thank my sister Jade, he said, and my heart clenched. I know she worked really hard as maid of honor, and I'm grateful to have both of my favorite women here celebrating with me tonight. The irony was painful. As Marcus handed the microphone back to the DJ, I stepped forward. Actually, I said, my voice carrying across the reception area, I'd like to say something too. Marcus looked surprised but not displeased. Of course, Jade. Go ahead. Vivian's eyes narrowed as I took the microphone, but she maintained her smile for the crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. This really has been an unforgettable evening. I've learned so much about the people I thought I knew. When I could see some guests nodding, probably thinking I was about to give another heartfelt speech about love and family. You know, they say you really get to know someone's true character at weddings. All the stress and emotion tends to bring out people's real personalities. Vivian's smile was starting to look strained. I was just in the bridal suite, and I overheard the most interesting conversation, I continued, pulling out my phone. I think you should all hear what our beautiful bride really thinks about tonight's celebration. Jade, what are you doing? Marcus asked, confusion and warning in his voice. I'm being honest, I said, echoing Vivian's own words from earlier, just like Vivian was when she decided to humiliate me in front of all of you. Before anyone could stop me, I pressed play. Vivian's voice filled the reception area, crystal clear and unmistakably cruel. Did you see her pathetic little face when I called her out? Acting like Marcus is some kind of hero for raising his trashy sister. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the crowd, and I watched the color drain from Vivian's face as her own voice continued. The truth is, I can't stand her. She's everything I hate about poor people. Desperate, clingy, and completely pathetic. Turn it off! Vivian lunged for the phone, but I stepped back, letting the recording continue. Marcus is so stupid. He actually thinks I care about his... A charity case sister. The plan was always to get rid of her once we were married. Marcus stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he heard his new wife's true feelings about the sister who'd raised him. Within 6 months, she'll be completely out of our lives. Vivian's recorded voice continued mercilessly.